Hi, it's Steve Hargadon, and we have made it. This is the last session of the inaugural Learning Revolution Conference. I'm so delighted to have Michael Strong here. Michael came on the Future of Education interview series with me, and I loved talking to him. He's going to talk to us about creating great educational communities. And, like Roger Schenck just before him, no slides. Michael, welcome.
Thanks, Steve. I'm delighted to be here.
Really glad to have you here. Hang on one second. I'm going to go through a couple of intro slides. Thanks to ClassFlow and Blackboard Collaborate for making this event and next week's Reinventing the Classroom event possible. And for those of you who are attending live and are in our studio audience, look to the left of the map, click on the star icon. You'll probably need to click on it twice. And then click where you are and give us a shout out. Oh, we've got India, Australia, New Zealand. How fun.
Cool.
So who's in the Caribbean or Central/Latin America there? Grand Cayman. Have fun. Okay, well, feel free to keep notes going in the chat, but I'm going to move us forward so we can hear from Michael. Michael, thanks for being here. People have seen your bio on the website, so I'm not going to go through that, but if there's any background you want to give, please feel free to do so, and then let me know how I can help you.
Okay, great. Well, first of all, I feel deeply aligned with Steve. He's somebody who really appreciates what I'm doing, and so he and I did have fun on our conversation. So I also like to mention I'm a big fan of Roger Schenck, and I'll probably be using Roger's software in the new tool I'm creating. So it feels like a lot of common allies from around here. I want to talk about creating great educational communities, because I back up a little bit. I spent 15 years in K-12 education, starting as a Socratic seminar teacher trainer in public schools in Chicago, Illinois, inner city, and then I was hired as a full-time teacher trainer in Socratic seminars in Alaska. Parents, we were on soft money after 2 years. We ran out of funding, and some parents loved what I was doing and asked me to create a private school there. And that led to a series of creating schools based largely on Socratic dialogue, including several private schools, a charter school, some Montessori, some for highly gifted students, one in rural New Mexico. And throughout those experiences, I began to realize that, at least from my perspective, what was effective, or what was most important to effectiveness, was not so much the books or the content or even the method. You could say that Socratic is a method. But I would say that all the schools I was at obtained their deepest successes by means of creating a great learning culture. And I'll go some into the Socratic culture I created, then talk about Montessori culture, and then talk about other kinds of education I've seen really great culture created, so that we can get a sense for what I mean by a great educational culture, results in a great educational community. When I first started learning to lead Socratic seminars as students, I thought it was about picking a great text. And basically, I'll give you a scenario. A Socratic seminar is a group discussion where 10 to 15 students, can be 30 or so, but it's much better if it's a smaller group. So I'll speak to the ideal at this point. We can do questions later on more difficult circumstances. But 10 to 15 students in a circle facing each other. We read together difficult material, a lot of times philosophical poetry, but also science, literature, piece of art, all sorts of things, and discuss the ideas. And originally I thought it was a matter of simply asking a good question or picking good content, and then the conversation would flow. In some cases the conversation is great, in other cases it was rotten. And I would often be in a public school where I teach the same English class, 7 sections in a row. I was the same person, I used the same text, and sometimes third period would be fantastic, seventh period would be a disaster. Same person, same text, what was the variable? And my colleagues in Alaska were more focused on group dynamics. And one of the things that we focus on, very simple, explicit teaching of interpersonal relationships. So at the most basic level, and there are some places where this is appropriate, looking in the eye or one person speaking at a time. At more sophisticated levels, we could ask students to evaluate the session themselves and then to point out what they thought would improve the session and actually have dialogue on how to improve the conversation. Sometimes students would say, well, that sucks because only a few students dominated it. And then I often respond by saying, well, if it is the case that sessions are more interesting when we have many different students speaking rather than just a few, what can we use to improve that? And then what can you in particular do? Of course, part of that is putting them in the thought. If they didn't speak and if they thought class was more interesting, I would say, well, next time if I call on you, will you help create more diverse voices? And can you call on other students and them into the conversation? And really, I tried to shift the whole situation from one in which, I can see the rustling come in. Is that better? Maybe I'll trim down my sound. Is that better?
There is a slight background noise, Michael, but I just assumed it was related to your microphone or the connection. You are clear. It's just a little bit of a rustling noise.
Okay. So I would try to shift the responsibility for the quality of the dialogue and the nature of the interaction from myself leading the discussion to students understanding the dynamics through which conversations could be improved, and a few dominating is a simple but important example of that, and coaching them on how to be responsible for bringing more students into the conversation. So for instance, if I turn to a student and say, what do you think? Sometimes that's not a very effective way to get a shy student into the conversation. Instead, I might say, am I making sense or not? A simple yes or no question where I'm the one who apparently may not be adequately clear in what I'm saying. And training students to see how am I making sense or not is less confrontational than what do you think? Sometimes middle school students can be aggressive. Why aren't you talking? Just say something. And so I coach them on very basic sorts of interpersonal interactions. And by means of systematic coaching of those interactions, gradually the students became more pleased with the fact that they could take on responsibility and they could fix the session. And the quality of the sessions did consistently improve. After a great session, I'd ask them, well, why was that one so great? And we'd debrief and try to evaluate it. On a session where maybe we'd had a few good ones and had a bad one, okay, let's diagnose that, see what happened, see what went wrong. And as much as possible, without blaming any particular individual, really become analytical about the structures that led to success. Over time, I would say that I lovingly think of middle school students as the most difficult. Elementary school students are mostly compliant. By high school age, they're again becoming somewhat more compliant. Middle school students are bundles of new hormones and energy all over the place. But even with middle school students, by means of systematic coaching, they became, in many ways, I would say, more proficient at having a constructive conversation than are most groups of adults. At one point, I actually had some business people come in. My work at that time was supported by Alaska's Youth Ready for Work, representing 25% of the employers in Alaska, private sector employers. And as the business leaders from this organization come and observe my class pre and post, 4 months between. And they noted how dramatically the students had improved in how they interacted as groups. This sort of improved interaction also resulted in dramatically improved test scores. Because of the nature of the work I was doing, I first used the Watson Glaser critical thinking appraisal to evaluate progress pre and post, because we were doing a lot of critical thinking. Then I realized that the SAT verbal for Americans, anybody around the world, could take the college board SAT to get into US, it's a familiar and high-stakes test. So I would use the SAT verbal pre and post. If you look at the SAT verbal, largely of passages of sophisticated prose on which students need to answer nuanced questions of meaning. And the students had dramatic gains in both Watson Webster and FAQ Gödel. And I saw this as because we were more successful at having more students engaged a much higher percentage of the time and more engaged on the cognitive activity itself. If you're trying to lead discussions and most of the students are disengaged most of the time, of course they're not going to be learning. And as I appreciated that it wasn't just the questions I was asking of the text, but really the culture I formed in the classroom, I started training teachers how to lead these discussions and helping them see how a lot of times you can have this dreadful discussion if there are social dysfunctions. And so what I developed various ways to coach teachers on how to coach dysfunctions in the group dynamic, and then also coaching students on how to coach each other, such that my ideal classes were ones where the adults could completely pull back and the students would run their own conversations and be very focused on really pushing each other to decipher very sophisticated text. About this time, I first encountered Montessori education. I'd heard Montessori, I'd never spent a lot of time in it. But I began working in a Montessori school where some Montessori educators saw my Socratic course as an appropriate secondary school sequel to Montessori Elementary. I read some Montessori, but what was most instructive was observing the Montessori classroom. And Maria Montessori's great genius was to realize that you can give children freedom within a structured environment. So, obviously there are Montessori materials for which she's famous. Maria Montessori herself was acutely aware of the fact that the adults and other children were also part of the environment. And in order to create a successful Montessori classroom, it had to be Montessori terminology normalized. What that means is, the typical pattern in the Montessori classroom is the students choose their work from the materials around the perimeter of the classroom, and they pull out a little mat, and this happens in a primary classroom of 3 to 5 year olds, and they set the material on the mat and start engaging in whatever the activity associated with that particular material is. But the whole system does not work if you have kids running across the classroom or screaming or just staring off, bumbling around a lot. The students need to be trained to pull out the mat, pull out the work carefully, focus on the work, and then put it all away when they're done. And that's just a very slim part of it. But I saw that Montessori teachers spent a lot of time training students in what I call, again, the cultural norms of the classroom. So that part of their work as educators was certainly to teach the students how to use the pink tower or the quadratic cube or whatever piece of Montessori material. But in some ways, an even more important part was training the students in the norms of the classroom, such that students would, even again in primary school, to some extent enforce the norms of the classroom. And in a successful Montessori classroom, again, Maria Montessori herself talks about being able to walk out of the classroom and continue working as if the teacher was not even there. And seeing the similarity between my Socratic dialogue on one hand and Montessori classroom with elementary school students, although they were very different approaches in learning to some extent, in both cases it seemed as if the most productive results were achieved when the teacher was focused not just on the, as it were, content of the pedagogy, or the content of the curriculum, but really on creating a very specific culture. To give you one other example, I'm currently talking about working with a math educator who specializes in math competitions for secondary school students who has an after-school program. And perhaps for people who aren't familiar with math competitions, they might think, oh, it's all about learning hard math. His approach is all about creating a culture once again. He certainly has math problems that he has the students to work on, but he has the students work in groups and in teams. And although he does some coaching of the mathematics itself, a lot of what he tries to do is train the students to work constructively together on the problem. Some of this is social norms, such as no insults, no bullying, that sort of thing. But a lot of successful math competition champions, like, people have to learn to think creatively in new and different ways. And so he developed this attitude of brainstorming and trying on hypotheses and bouncing ideas off each other's ideas, and really collaborative culture. Because he knows that the students will learn more from each other and become more capable, creative mathematical thinkers if they are bouncing ideas. You know, one of the things I often talk about in the experience I want to recreate in the kind of classrooms I work on is, you know, many people in college have a really wonderful experience of, you know, staying up late, talking about ideas. You're just so excited about ideas you can't even go to sleep. And yet, that's not the kind of intellectual experience most students have in secondary school or elementary. So both in my credit work and in Matt Crawford's math competition coaching, he wants to create this dynamic where the kids are having fun and having a blast, arguing about math, talking about math, finding hypotheses, playing around with new solutions, and respecting each other as each other fail and experiment, as opposed to a certain kind of math machismo or math bullying that can take place in some kinds of more traditional math classrooms. And as increasingly I generalize this approach to culture, I realize that, you know, my great passion is to support student learning very broadly. And one of the questions I think a lot of us have is why so many, there's a very well-known expression that education should be about lighting a fire rather than filling a pail. And if you look at quotations on education, if you just Google quotations on education, almost all, you know, maybe 100%, I'm sure somebody can find an exception, but almost all the quotations are more in the spirit of lighting a fire rather than filling a pail. And that is, everyone loves to be inspired in order to learn, and every educator, I believe, would ideally want to inspire their children, the students, rather than have a circumstance where one is forcing the reluctant students to, you know, ingest information they're really not interested in ingesting. So the question is, if most educators, and certainly most famous thinkers, believe that education should be about lighting a fire, why is almost all education around the world more like filling a pail? And I think one of the reasons for that, one of the reasons is that it's certainly imposed by law in many countries, but a secondary and non-trivial secondary reason is that it's very hard to obtain high-quality, consistently high-quality, scalable education in a more free-form sort of way. I think all of us have had individual teachers in classrooms, and there's been some individual schools where children were given a lot of freedom to follow their own script. But very often those programs can end up in chaos or unconstructive activity, or the parents may be afraid that this may be the case, that the school may not end up being productive. One example I'll use is many people are familiar with Sudbury Valley schools, and I certainly have a lot of respect for the idea of Sudbury Valley schools, but in Sudbury Valley, it's like some of them are very, very unstructured, let the students do for once. There's a famous intellectual in the 20th century who once told he was a great teacher, and he said, when he responded, "But I do nothing," and the person said, "But the way in which you do nothing is so important." And I take that as an example of how I think some Sudbury Valley schools are very successful, because the way in which the adult allows children to pursue their own interests is totally different. I'll give you an example. I think there's a sense in which attention is love, and whatever you give attention to, children are more likely to do. If you give attention to misbehavior, that rewards misbehavior. If you give attention only to right answers, that rewards right answers. If you give attention to intellectual inquiry and discovery, that rewards intellectual inquiry and discovery. So, as much as possible, I think an effective educator will create an individual relationship with students where the positive traits that are desired are rewarded, such that the student over time spontaneously engages in the spontaneous behavior, those positive behaviors. In such a situation, very often it looks as if the teacher is doing nothing, but while the teacher's been doing nothing, they've been paying attention to the right kinds of behaviors, and thus creating an atmosphere in which those are rewarded. And of course, as other students see which behaviors are rewarded by the adults, if those behaviors indeed have some value, the students will start to reward those behaviors as well. And my most successful schools are always the ones where the students spontaneously talk about ideas at lunchroom and after school. And I think likewise in a successful Sudbury school, the children are spontaneously thinking and talking about ideas. But that's in part because the adult has been focused on giving those interviews, focused on paying attention to those kinds of behaviors. I've also been in Sudbury schools that are not very effective because some teachers take the notion, do nothing or only follow the child's interests or don't intervene so literally that they don't really provide the guidance that makes for an effective self-directed classroom. So to give one other piece of this, and we'll switch to questions, I once read a book about how some teachers were extraordinarily successful at creating world-class performance. So, for example, there was a cheerleading team in Kentucky that would repeatedly win the national championship, or there was a debate team in Texas that would repeatedly win the state championship. And of course, it's not because the water in those communities resulted in high performance. And so, when you looked at exactly what was going on with these coaches and teachers, there were three elements. One was the students knew the adult cared. Second was the adult created very high standards of performance. And then finally, the third piece, the adult is capable of coaching students to high levels of performance. And just to take the first two, if there is caring but not high standards, one doesn't achieve great performance. If there are high standards, but there is an atmosphere of fear, you also can't consistently create high standards with diverse populations of students. So the key is really balancing the love on the one hand or care with the high standards. And then finally, the meticulous coaching to achieve that world-class performance. But that recipe can be done in a very free-flowing environment. So as an educator who currently am creating a school where the students will have a great deal of self-direction, but my main job in leading schools, in a certain sense, would be to coach teachers to, on the one hand, have the right balance of care and high standards, and then know how to coach the performance to high standards. And it sounds very simple, but many people, I find that many adults, even if they have ideas, very good ideas about how they'd like to behave in the classroom, bring the patterns they had either when they were taught as a child or sometimes when they were raised as a child. And it's not necessarily easy to change the way one interacts. So a lot of what we're working on doing is coaching the teachers in real time so that they can demonstrate to students that they care, that they have high standards, and gracefully coach them on the specific practices. And for debate, it would be one thing. For math competitions, very different. Actually, try to dialogue different from debate, writing is different. But once one has that relationship established, then to make it a natural, spontaneous process to seek excellence, because one is seeking excellence based on this foundation. So to go back to why we have the film tail around the world, I think part of the reason is we haven't had adequate quality control in how we create classroom cultures that will consistently result in great educational communities. And while we've had, I think, some of the most spectacular results from inspired teachers that support students' passions and interests in the classroom, those systems have not scaled in a big way, in part because they have been inconsistent outcomes. And I think one of the most interesting problems that we need to solve in the 21st century is how to create classroom cultures, school cultures that are consistently high quality in the sense of students feeling validated and happy, and also achieving extraordinary results. I'll pause there. There's a question on charter schools. I assume, Jenny, you mean charter schools as in the United States? If so, I'll go ahead and answer that. New Zealand, I'm not sure exactly how they are in New Zealand, but in the United States, I created a charter school here. In the United States, charter schools were designed with the intention of giving educational teachers, educators, a great deal more freedom so that they could do experiments like the kind I'm describing. And our charter school focused on Socratic dialogue is different from the mainstream public schools. That said, then I don't know New Zealand, but in the United States, unfortunately, in I believe 2003, No Child Left Behind was passed, which was legislation that required high-stakes testing for all public and charter schools. And at this, and through these high-stakes tests, if schools, public or charter, don't achieve annual yearly progress in these high-stakes tests, then there are also big penalties. What No Child Left Behind law has done in the United States is it has essentially created an atmosphere of fear and anxiety due to high-stakes testing tests. And as a consequence, I think it's really undermined the possibilities in higher education and charter schools. If charter schools are happening in New Zealand, I hope you can avoid having the high-stakes testing issue. Just to talk a little bit more about school choice, I'm a big fan of school choice in general, but I think in order to allow for experiments and inspired education to take place, we need people to understand that we need diversity in education. We need lots of different outcomes. We need parents and educators to discover new ways to evaluate students, new ways to teach students, and we cannot be forced to teach to the same tests nationally over and over and over again, because that creates this anxiety, fear that No Child Left Behind is created here. So are there other questions or comments?
Michael, this theme of movement from one way of thinking about education to another was a large part of the discussion with Roger. And the kind of the theme that came up was the financial incentives and benefits to the existing system and the degrees to which changing that narrative is hard because of those who benefit from the current narrative. How have you experienced people making the shift of how they think about learning?
That's a great question. So first, before I go into it, I would say actually Roger Schenk's approach is another case where you've got mentors, and part of what they need to do to scale up what they're doing is find a way to train the mentors, and I would describe that again as a sort of cultural process. In terms of shifts, in the United States, 1/3 of adolescents are on prescription medication, mostly ADHD or antidepressants, which I think is a catastrophic failure. It's a disaster that our adolescents are being drugged. And that doesn't include all the health medication associated with children drinking and doing drugs and all sorts of things. A lot of the small alternative schools I've created attracted parents with children who seem to be in crisis one way or another. And I have seen countless students go from being suicidal or clinically depressed or completely withdrawn in school to being vibrant and alive. I just visited a school today, Skybridge Academy, that I helped start here in Austin. And Ariel Miller, the director of Skybridge, has had numerous cases of kids being on medication, heavily medicated, and withdrawing medication, becoming happy and flourishing within a few weeks or months. So one version of the answer is Steve, which is not a desirable one, is there are some parents and teams that are in such urgent need that they are escaping the system because the system is killing their children. We'll describe that harshly. Certainly damaging their children. I think again, I know the U.S. best, I think another factor that's moving in that direction is the spectacular success of many homeschooled children. Peter Thiel is one of the founders of PayPal, Silicon Valley investor and entrepreneur, and he funded a program called 20 Under 20 Thiel Fellows, where every year he gives 20 students under the age of 20 $100,000 to drop out of college and start a business. And while some people regard it as controversial, the great thing that I think he's doing is showing that starting a business rather than going to college can be legitimate. And of course, a lot of the most successful tech entrepreneurs were high school or college dropouts. certainly Michael Dell, Steve Jobs were dropouts. Bill Gates was a college dropout. Richard Branson was a high school dropout. John Mackey, the founder of Whole Foods, was a college dropout. So Thiel is doing something that I think has already been happening, but he's trying to validate it. But one of the most interesting things about the Thiel 20 Under 20 program is that many, if not most, of the successful applicants were homeschooled. And they're just incredibly self-motivated, autonomous, mature young people who are already doing, in some cases, PhD-level scientific research and creating new devices and products based on what they've been doing. And so I think as we see, so on one hand you've got the, oh my gosh, my child is in a horrible situation, but on the other hand we've got positive examples of young people achieving far more than would be plausible while they were in school. And I think there's been a movement of many people seeing that school as it was in the 20th century is simply obsolete, that it's not necessary, it's tough to do something different. And part of what I'm trying to do with the principal I'm creating an option is to create a high-end brand. Just talk about the brand a little bit. Most parents are very anxious and fearful. And most of the parents are concerned about putting their kids into elite colleges. And so most, not all, but many of the elite private schools, prep schools, are relatively conventional. There's some innovation and more innovation at the elite prep schools, but they're not nearly as innovative as I would like. But I think there are more and more parents that are developing the confidence to try something that's different from the traditional model in private education as well. And by creating a high-end alternative private school that is very successful either at developing entrepreneurs and elite college admission, I help to kind of validate this model yet again. A lot of times there's a wonderful TED video called How to Start a Movement, and 3-minute video, very fun. Somebody can Google it and post it. I talk with my hands, so I have a hard time sending you things in the chat. I'm talking with my hands over it, even though you can't see me. But this video, How to Start a Movement, has one silly guy standing up in the middle of a field, kind of a park, and lots of people are sitting down picnicking. He's dancing in a stupid way. And the narrator makes the point that only when another person starts up and does silly dancing, and then a third starts silly dancing, and then a few minutes later, everybody starts sitting up and silly dancing. And the whole notion is it's kind of a tipping point phenomenon. And it's the second and third person that does it that really makes the whole thing flip from one idiot to, oh, this is what everybody's doing, and you feel like an idiot if you're sitting in the ground. So to go to education, I'm hoping to see in the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years, maybe 10 to 15, maybe 20 years, a tipping point in terms of great mass of parents realizing, oh, traditional education is a waste of time, and in some cases ethically harmful to my child. Meanwhile, look at all of these fabulous alternative options that are successful and proven. At that point, it's just like technology. You've seen the technology adoption cycle, the kind of leading edge of crazies, and I think that was in education maybe 20, 30 years ago. But now we've got a lot of early adopters who are, they're already eagerly pursuing some of these new options, and at some point it will be the mainstream. We just need to kind of continue to create high-quality, proven options and explain to people why the old model is, in many cases, harmful, and the new model can be spectacularly more effective at developing not only professionally successful, but happy, healthy human beings. So I didn't answer the thing about vested interest, but they're there. I'll totally, completely agree with Roger on that one.
Okay, so if you have a question for Michael, you can put it in the chat, or you can grab the microphone. I'm going to give microphone privileges to anybody who would like, and you just click on the talk button. We're at the end of a long day.
I understand. Let's try to start a movement sometimes. Freedom is again.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I found it. I didn't put the link in. Here I was thinking I was.
There you go. You're doing a favor,
and I didn't actually put the link in. I'll get it right now.
I'll let me go ahead and talk a little bit more about how hard it is to change things. One of the things I realized years ago, I've been in innovative education for about 25 years now, is that the default system, the existing system, really around the world, is like a default operating system. And I expect many people in the audience, if not all, are old enough to remember when Microsoft Windows was the dominant operating system and people thought that Apple was going to die, Linux had not yet really come around, and basically everybody thought they had to buy Microsoft-compatible computers. There were two crazy Apple people, but some people thought it was zero. And that sort of phenomenon of once everybody's locked into a dominant operating system, VHS versus Betamax. Betamax was destroyed by the dominance of VHS. It's hard to introduce a new one. And one of the things I realized is the existing dominant operating system in education is one where there's grade level curriculum, 4th grade science, 7th grade history, 9th grade English. There are tests geared to those curricula. There are textbooks based on those curricula. Teachers have certifications based on whether they're an elementary teacher or middle school science or high school language arts teacher. There's an entire system built around this standard. And if you are trying to do something fundamentally different, as Roger is, and as I am, as Montessori is, Waldorf is, you have to create everything from scratch. You have to create not only your own curriculum, you have to create your own teacher training, you have to create your own system of evaluation. You don't have credibility, so in a way you have to build your own credibility. And so the challenges, the existing system is legislatively financed and enforced. They've got basically all of the money and power. It's immense. And people talk a lot about corporatism, and yes, the corporate testing companies are very powerful. The teachers' unions are also very powerful. The administrators. One of the strange things to me is in most places the PTA, Parent Teachers Associations, are also in the establishment. And it seems like the parents have bought into the system. And so when you've got so many different chunks committed to the existing system, it's very hard for new alternatives to get launched. That said, the new alternatives are growing. Certainly homeschooling and unschooling is growing. Charter school movement is growing, even though many of us are conventional. My sense is that the old system is simply obsolete, and even though it has coercive hold on mainstream education, bit by bit we are winning. Adult Learning Institute. Well, that's a great question. I don't know exactly, I don't know how the system is, but one of the things that I think has been most successful are, in New York City, for instance, graduate from Yale with a degree in English is pretty much unemployable. So there are all these private institutes that have sprung up where in, say, 8 weeks you can learn social media or graphic design or web design or basic programming. I call those kind of 21st century skills. Because if you have a certain set of skills, you're highly employable. And a lot of bright people are both taking the courses and creating ways to teach those courses. Roger Schenk has a great software development course. And these sorts of courses really allow students to kind of follow their own path, and that they're entirely self-motivated, they're completely voluntary. In a lot of ways, there are peer coaching systems built into these systems. So I would say, with respect to the 21st century skills I'm talking about, it's very much going into effective real-time learning, just-in-time learning, when you learn what you need and when and how. And there are networks of people who are either creating institutions or creating voluntary nodes where people become great at that. And in a certain sense, you could also say, the web itself. I know lots of software programmers who basically learn on their own by means of, going to various communities. They want to learn Python, they go to a Python forum and ask people who are more experienced than them, how do I do this, how do I do that? So in some ways I'm optimistic about at least those sorts of adult learning processes. I would say one other obstacle actually that comes up is legally required credentials. I think one of the reasons that we're seeing a lot of effective, spontaneous, dynamic learning in the 21st century skills of programming, web design, social media, etc., is that there are no legal credentials required. You don't have to go to a board certification to be board certified as a graphic designer or a social media expert. Whereas I think that credentialism means that the existing institutions have legal loopholes on how to educate people for any career path in which legally required licenses and credentials are mandatory. So in my optimistic vision of things, we also have to reduce unnecessary occupational licensure as much as possible. One my favorite anecdote on this, in the 1990s, there was a 15-year-old who was ranked the top legal expert on AboutMe.com website at the time. And when the lawyers realized that a 15-year-old was the top-ranked legal expert, it was a community ranking system. They all ganged up on him and trashed his ranking, so he fell down. And when the non-attorneys realized the attorneys had, bullied basically this 15-year-old, they gathered together and brought his ranking back to the top. But it turned out that this kid his brother had been murdered a few years earlier, and the murderer, who was known, was not brought to justice. He was constant that this young person became monomaniacally focused on watching legal TV shows and then reading legal books as well. And as a consequence, he really did have very significant expertise. And because he was friendly, engaging, and coachable, he was highly ranked as an expert. But that's the sort of thing where the credentialing system is never allowed that. I feel your tiredness. High fees and lack of government-funded support. Well, this is the big challenge. So, one of the biggest challenges is that many people are faced with either you have government-supported education, which often comes with strangling bureaucracies, or you're forced completely privately, where then only a certain demographic of students can typically afford the education. And so one of the policy innovations that I'm interested in are either tuition tax credits or donation tax credits, where people can get tax credits for donation tax credits, where you can actually get a tax credit for donating funds to scholarship. Tuition tax credits where you can deduct any money you can tuition also helps. But a lot of people are hopeful of breaking the connection between bureaucratic regulation of education and government funding. I'm not terribly optimistic, at least in the country as large as the United States. And so I'm looking for alternative funding mechanisms, such as tuition tax credits and donation tax credits. At the school level, this may not be applicable to some institutions, but at the school level, I'm looking at partnering with real estate developers because good schools add value to real estate. I'm also looking actually at having retail outlets associated with schools, because often parents have asked me as an educator about learning games, learning books, and videos, and diverse learning resources, as well as sell them and have that be a profit center. There's also potential for a coffee shop. I'm also working with an entrepreneurial incubator here in Austin, in Tech Ranch, and their model consists of various sorts of entrepreneurial coaching and education. In some ways, they provide an education, they just barely break even with that. But then they also take an equity stake in the companies that are launched. And so the idea is, even though the founder is not really just barely covering expenses with tuition, by means of getting an equity stake in entrepreneurs, if a few of those entrepreneurs take off and do well, then ultimately that'll be revenue stream for the institution. So in a different case, I know a school in Senegal that helps Senegalese players come to the U.S. play professional, first college basketball and professional basketball. And I've been encouraging them to obtain a legal commitment that their students can give back 10% of their earnings for a period of time. Because even though a small percentage are going to be professional basketball players, do, they make enough money that it would be a great funding source for schools. But I think we need to be radically innovative in different ways to fund education that allows us to be innovative educators to maintain our economy.
Michael, Roger seemed to have two kind of very different takes on online learning or the potential of technology. On the one hand, he felt like all learning is one-to-one. And on the other hand, and so the idea of online learning as it's currently described doesn't make any sense to him. However, at the same time, he sees the opportunity to connect with other people online as being a huge part of a shift toward more vocation education, and vocation in the best sense of that word. What's your feeling about online?
Well, first of all, of course, there are radically different kinds of learners. There are a few learners who can learn truly individually, but I think those are a fraction, a small fraction. The other thing is, I think, with experience as a learner and learning material on one's own initially in groups, one can become better at learning completely alone. But I think most people are fundamentally social, and except for a small percentage, most people are going to be more effective in a sense of community. I personally love physical community where we get together in person, and I think there will always be demand for that. Some people thought when VHS came out that nobody would go to movie theaters anymore, but even just to watch a movie, people still have to go out and do social. So I think there will always be demand for learning communities. We do need to focus more on the community part of it, which is why I would focus on focusing community. So on one hand, we'll have a few individuals. I think we're going to have more and more people focusing on really rich communities, which may, by the way, use technology extensively. Everything I said is consistent with using technology extensively. I'm more focused on human-to-human interaction. What do we have, whether it's 3 to 5 people in the room, sometimes talking with each other, sometimes learning using technology, or if it's 10 or 15 or more, sometimes talking, sometimes working one-on-one, sometimes working alone with computers, whatever. So I would add to all of those different kinds of models, of course, the online communities that Roger is referring to, where all of a sudden now, as I said earlier, the early beginning Python programmers can have access to people around the world learning about it, or if you have more esoteric takes. In some ways, I see a lot of blogs becoming learning communities, where somebody is very interested in a particular topic and trying to blog on it. A lot of them in the comment section, people will be talking and arguing about how to understand this issue more deeply. So I certainly see the integration of technology and community broadly construed as the direction going forward, and then people will individually select their mix between alone, human-to-human, real contact, or virtual contact.
Good. So kind of a final call then maybe for questions at this point?
Tired bunch.
Yes, there's some typing going on now. You can see the little blue icon with the lines indicates typing. We'll make sure nobody's typing a question.
One other point I'd like to make that I think is relevant to how to create innovation, Roger and I just spoke slightly about this, is that in the United States, and I think in most countries, except in most countries, college admissions really drive a lot of, quite aside from state-mandated curriculum, the expectations of college admissions officers is a driving force. And in the United States, the elite colleges are increasingly recognizing that individual passion and deep expertise in the chosen passion is more valuable than just a stacked resume with lots of goodies. So, for instance, I was recently talking to Jeff Brentel, who just stepped down as the director of admissions at Yale, and he acknowledged that they are interested in students with SAT scores because they want to make sure they have bad academic ability. I also like to see an AP, a few, doesn't need to be good, you could look at a couple of AP or IB courses passed. Again, this validates the notion there's plenty of academic ability. But beyond that, he said, very often we would rather have students who have all found a passion and pursued it deeply than a student simply stack their resume with, student council and varsity sports and orchestra, and he's clearly just, trying to show how ambitious they were. So I would say there, and I've heard other admissions officers talk in similar ways, but I think there is a movement to talk more about internal motivation rather than external motivation. And if you look at a lot of Silicon Valley entrepreneurs, startups, they'll talk about how they want to see internally driven people rather than externally driven people. Finally, just one more optimistic thing, Google recently talked about how they don't even care about degrees. So in hiring, Google is explicitly now saying they want to see people who are intellectually curious, passionate, and capable of what they do. And they really don't care about credentials, degrees, having job skills. So I'm always looking for these kind of bright spots that will help us shift the energy and prove that the old model is no longer necessary. And once again, good news is some in college admissions, but also in technological entrepreneurship, there are new openings. Because there's a lot of literature on self-motivation. A lot of books on learning validate what we're talking about. It's just how do we escape the system.
Yeah, I'll give a quick plug for Cal Newport's book, How to Be a High School Superstar. I felt like Cal really captured that concept of doing deeply what you like to do and how that does come through and ends up being, in many ways, actually a fairly good way of identifying those who end up doing well in college.
Excellent. That sounds like a perfect book. And what's sad is that there are so many people who come independent, and some of it, a lot of people are concerned about the fact that it looks as if social mobility may be closed out. And a lot of people are concerned about in the 21st century there won't be enough jobs because a lot of manufacturing jobs are disappearing. With robotics will increasingly take over more jobs. Software will increasingly take over more jobs. So some people are afraid that we'll have a few very wealthy and successful people in kind of the educated professional class, and a lot of people who, even if governments needed to raise funds in a big way, if people don't have productive work to do, there are all sorts of, a lot of people are depressed. Gallup says they found work is the most important thing to most people, even more so than health or money or education. People want jobs where they feel valuable. And I see an urgency in this case to help people develop, let's say, more creative skills so that they can find new ways to be valuable. So I think we will have endless need for better ways of living. But in order to discover and develop those new better ways of living, people do need to develop the ability to be passion-driven and creative. And I think the people that I'm most afraid of being miserable in the 21st century are those that are externally motivated rather than internally motivated. And I think we have large numbers of those people.
Michael, I think we're done.
Okay. Okay. Well, it's wonderful to reconnect. You're most welcome, Peggy. Wonderful to reconnect with you, Steve. And
yes.
look forward to connecting again soon. And if anybody wants to get in touch with me, I'll give you an email address. This one. Feel free to get in touch with me via email. Sometimes I have a backlog and can't be responsive, but anybody trying to do something innovative and educational along these lines, I'll try to support you in any way I can.
That's so appreciated, Michael. Thanks for capping off in a lovely way, a lovely day. Thanks, everybody, for being here. What a terrific event. I'm going to turn off the recording right now.